The stars were silent, cold, and endless. In that darkness drifted a broken fleet of ships, old and damaged, their lights flickering like dying candles. These ships carried the last survivors of a proud alien race, a people once full of life and dreams. Now they were weak, hungry, and filled with fear. Their homeworld was gone, burned by a cruel enemy that had shown no mercy. Once they had believed the Galactic Council would protect them. The Council had promised safety, promised unity, promised that no world would ever stand alone. But when the war came, when fire rained on their cities, the Council turned away. The pleas for help were ignored, the distress signals unanswered. One by one, their allies closed their doors and their fleets vanished into the stars. And so the survivors fled, carrying nothing but grief and the memory of betrayal. Inside the largest ship, the alien leader stood by a cracked viewport. His name was Oral, his eyes dim and hollow, his body thin from days without food. He watched the endless void and wondered how much longer his people could last. The engines were nearly dry. The food storage was almost empty. Children cried in the dark corridors, their voices faint. Mothers tried to comfort them with stories of a home that no longer existed. Old warriors sat in silence, ashamed that they could not protect the young. Every day felt heavier than the last. Every heartbeat carried the same question. Would anyone save them? Or would the galaxy truly abandon them to die? On one of the smaller ships, a young alien named Saren listened to the static on the radio. He had been trying for days to catch a signal, any proof that someone cared. His fingers trembled as he repeated the same message. We are refugees. Our world is gone. We are dying. Please help us. Again and again, he sent it. Into the emptiness again and again, only silence answered. Sometimes he thought he heard a whisper of sound, but it was only the ghost of broken channels. Still he kept calling, his heart refusing to surrender. But hope was fading with every hour. The fleet's lights grew dimmer as power was rationed. Ships that once flew proudly through star systems were now nothing more than drifting tombs. Every corridor smelled of smoke and rust. Every wall carried scars of battles they could not win. The stars looked beautiful from afar, but to the refugees, they were only cruel reminders. They had crossed system after system only to be turned away. No safe harbor, no kind hand. The galaxy had seen their suffering and chosen to look away, and so the name of their people began to fade, as if they were ghosts already forgotten. Oral called a meeting with the few leaders who still had strength. They gathered around a dim projection of the fleet's status. Red warning lights covered the display. One elder spoke with a weak voice. We have less than a week of fuel, less than a week of food. We cannot continue. Another whispered. The council betrayed us. Our allies betrayed us. No one will come. Their words were heavy, heavier than the silence between them. But Oral did not speak right away. He looked at their tired faces, at the lines of despair. He knew what they were thinking. He knew what they feared. That soon there would be no reason to fight, no reason to hope. And yet deep inside him something refused to break. He remembered the cities of his world, the laughter of children, the pride of his people. He remembered the first time they joined the council, believing in peace, believing in unity. Those dreams were ashes now, but ashes could still carry fire. He clenched his hands and whispered, if the galaxy will not save us, then perhaps someone else will, someone we have never known. The others did not answer, their eyes empty, their hearts too tired to believe. Days passed, each one slower than the last. The survivors grew weaker, their voices fainter. Oral walked the halls of his ship, hearing the silence, hearing the despair. Every face asked him for answers he could not give. Every child's eyes cut into his soul. Saren still sent his message into the stars, his voice cracking from exhaustion. We are refugees. Our world is gone. We are dying. Please help us. The words floated through the void like a final prayer. Maybe no one would ever hear. Maybe they would fade into nothing, like their people. But still he sent the call. Still he refused to let it die. And then, on the 7th day of silence, the scanners picked up something. At first it was only a shadow in the distance, a faint movement against the background of stars. Saren's heart leapt, his hands shaking. He pressed his ear to the static, listening, waiting. Aurel rushed to the control deck, his chest tight with both fear and hope. The fleet stirred as whispers spread. Something is out there, another enemy, or maybe an answer. No one knew, no one dared to guess, but in the darkness, for the first time in many days, the survivors felt a spark of something they thought was gone. A spark of suspense, a spark of hope. The shadow in the distance grew larger. At first, the survivors thought it was only a trick, of failing sensors, another cruel lie of space. But as the minutes passed, the shape became clear. It was a ship. No, it was many ships, moving together in formation. Their size was massive, their metal hulls shining like dark steel against the stars. The alien fleet held its breath. Could this be the enemy returning? The same monsters who had destroyed their homeworld? Or was it someone else? Someone unknown? Aurel stood at the cracked viewport, his eyes fixed on the growing lights. He felt fear crawl across his skin, but also something strange. Something he had not felt in many days. A feeling he did not dare call hope. "Identify them," he ordered, his voice steady but his heart racing. Saren bent over the old scanner. His hands shaking as he worked, symbols flashed across the display, words in a language the refugees did not know. He frowned and whispered, "This is not the enemy. And it is not the Council either. These ships are different." The largest of the unknown ships moved forward, its engines glowing bright blue. It was shaped like a spear, sharp and powerful, with armor that looked heavier than anything the refugees had ever seen. The smaller ships surrounded it like loyal guardians. They were not sleek or elegant like the fleets of the Council. They were brutal, built for strength, built for war. The refugees whispered in fear. "Predators," one said. "Conquerors," another muttered. "What if they finish what the enemy began?" Aurel's voice cut through the panic. "Silence, we will not judge until we know." But inside, even he wondered, were these newcomers saviors or executioners? Then it happened. The radio crackled, alive with a sound so strange. A deep voice spoke, rough but clear. "This is Captain Reyes of the United Terran Fleet." The survivors froze, their hearts pounding. They had never heard this language before. Yet somehow the translator Core translated the words. The voice continued. "We have received your signal. We know your pain. You are not alone." The deck went silent. Every alien in the room stared at the radio as if it were a miracle, Saren whispered, his voice trembling. They answered. Someone finally answered. Aurel's chest tightened, his eyes wet with tears he had refused to shed. The galaxy had abandoned them, but this voice, this unknown human voice, had reached into the darkness and pulled them back. But still fear lingered. Were these humans truly allies? Or did they have their own plan? The unknown was always dangerous. Aurel spoke, into the comms, his voice careful. "This is Aurel, leader of the refugee fleet. Our people are dying. We ask for mercy, we ask for aid." There was a pause, only static. Then Captain Reyes answered, "You will have it. Prepare to receive supplies." Moments later, the human ships opened their hangar bays. Drones flew out carrying crates of food, water, and medicine. The refugees watched in disbelief as the supplies were delivered. Children cheered, mothers cried, warriors lowered their heads in gratitude. For the first time since the destruction of their home, they tasted hope. The food was strange, the water had a bitter taste. But to the starving it was sweeter than honey. The medicine brought color back to pale faces. The weak began to rise again, their voices returning. It felt like life itself had returned to the fleet, but even as joy filled the corridors, doubt remained. In a quiet room, the leaders gathered again. One elder spoke with suspicion. "Why? Would these humans help us? They owe us nothing. Perhaps they want to use us, perhaps they want us as soldiers." Another replied, "They fight like warriors. Their ships are built for war. Maybe they want to pull us into their battles." Oral listened, his mind heavy with the same thoughts. But then he remembered the voice, the words, "You are not alone." There had been no demand, no threat, only a promise. On the human flagship, Captain Reyes stood before his crew. The men and women around him looked tired, scarred from old battles, but their eyes burned with determination. "Mark my words," Reyes said, "we will not watch them die. No species deserves to be abandoned." A cheer rose in the command deck, for humanity remembered their own past. They too had been ignored by the Galactic Council, left to fight their own wars. They too had known betrayal, and they had sworn never to repeat that mistake with others. Back on Oral's ship, Saren sat by the radio listening. More human voices filled the air. Laughter, orders, chatter. They were strange, loud, full of energy, so different from the silence of the refugees. He whispered to himself, "They are strong, stronger than us, but they are not cruel." Night came, though in space there was no night, only the slow turning of stars. The refugees rested with full stomachs for the first time in weeks. The children slept without crying. The warriors dreamed not of death but of survival. Oral walked through the corridors, hearing the quiet breathing of his people. His heart was heavy but also lighter than before. He looked out at the human fleet. Their ships like silent guardians in the distance, he whispered softly. Maybe, just maybe, the galaxy has not abandoned us after all. Yet in the deepest part of his mind, he knew this was only the beginning. The enemy was still out there, and soon they would return. But now when that day came, they would not face it alone, they would stand with humanity. And humanity had already shown its heart. When the galaxy turned away, the humans had said the words that echoed across the stars, "You are not alone." The refugee fleet floated in the shadow of the human warships. The supplies had given them strength, but strength alone did not erase fear. Every corridor whispered with the same question. Why had these humans helped them? And what did the humans want in return? Oral stood in the command hall of his broken flagship. The air smelled of rust and smoke. Wires still sparked from old wounds in the walls. Around him, the leaders of the surviving ships gathered, their faces lined with exhaustion and suspicion. An elder leaned forward, his voice sharp. "We must decide, do we trust these humans, or do we run from them?" Another elder shook her head. Her eyes filled with doubt. "We cannot run, our ships are dead, we cannot fight, our warriors are weak, but trusting them may lead us into another trap." The debate grew louder. Some leaders argued that the humans were predators, that no race built such brutal ships without a hunger for conquest. Others said the humans were saviors, their actions proof of their honor. They had given food without asking for anything in return. They had spoken words of comfort instead of threats. But the scars of betrayal from the council still burned too deep. How could they trust again when trust had already cost them their world? In the corner, Saren listened silently, his eyes drifting to the small communicator by his side. He had spent hours listening to human voices across the channel. Laughter, orders, even arguments. They did not sound like conquerors. They sounded like people, alive and flawed, but determined. When he thought of them, he remembered the first words Captain Reyes had spoken. "You are not alone." Those words had carried more power than any weapon. Oral finally raised his hand and the room fell silent. His voice was calm, but heavy. "We stand at a crossroad. If we trust them, we risk our people again. If we refuse, then we may all starve and die. We must choose not with fear but with reason." The elders bowed their heads, their arguments fading. The choice was his, but even he felt the weight crushing his heart. Later, as the fleet drifted in the cold void, a human shuttle crossed the distance between the ships. Its hull was painted in silver and black, its engines bright with blue flame. The refugees watched with wide eyes as it approached. The shuttle docked with Oral's flagship, and a group of humans stepped inside. They wore armored suits, strong and heavy, but their weapons were held low, not raised. At their front was Captain Reyes, his face stern but his eyes steady. Oral walked forward to meet him, his body tense, his guard standing ready. For a long moment, no one spoke. Only the hum of broken engines filled the air. Then Reyes removed his helmet and bowed his head slightly. "You do not know us and we do not know you, but we heard your cry and we will not turn away." His voice was deep, honest, carrying no hint of deceit. Oral felt the weight of the room pressing down, every eye fixed on him. He wanted to believe, but belief was dangerous. He spoke slowly, his words careful. "Why? Why risk your lives? For strangers." Reyes looked around at the hollow faces of the refugees. For a moment he seemed to remember something from his own past. Then he answered, "Because we know what it feels like to be left to die. Once the Council ignored us too. Once the galaxy abandoned us and we swore we would never let it happen to others." The room went silent again. The elders whispered among themselves. Some still doubted, but others lowered their eyes. Ashamed of their suspicion, Saren's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel the truth in those words. He leaned forward and whispered softly, "They are not the Council. They are not like the others." Captain Reyes extended his hand, open and empty. It was a human gesture, one the aliens did not fully understand, but even without knowing its meaning, the refugees saw what it was. It was a gesture of trust, of peace. Oral looked at the hand, his mind racing. If he took it, his people would bind themselves to these humans. If he refused, his people might starve in silence. Every breath felt like a lifetime. Finally, slowly, Oral placed his own hand against Reyes's. The room gasped, some in fear, some in relief. Reyes smiled faintly, his eyes softening. "Then we stand together," he said. It was not a promise written in treaties, not a bond of politics. It was something older, something stronger, a choice made in the face of despair. When the humans left the ship, carrying with them the echoes of that choice, the refugees felt something stir inside. It was fragile, it was uncertain, but it was real. It was hope. That night, as Saren sat by the communicator, he heard human voices again. They spoke of repairs, of strategies, of supplies. But in their words he heard something deeper. A strength, a will to fight, a fire that had not died even when the galaxy abandoned them. He whispered to himself, "If they stand with us, then maybe we can stand too." And in the silence of the stars, the fleet of the abandoned felt the weight of their choice. They had opened their hearts to strangers. They had placed their fate in human hands. It was a risk that could end in salvation or destruction. But for the first time since their world had burned, they no longer felt alone. The galaxy had abandoned them, but humanity had said the words no one else dared. "We are with you." The refugee fleet no longer drifted in silence. Where once there had been only despair and hunger, now there was movement, voices, and the faint spark of life. Human supply drones moved between the ships like tireless workers bringing food, fuel, and medicine. Children who had not laughed in weeks now smiled weakly as they tasted warm meals. Old warriors who had been ready to die now stood a little, taller, their pride returning piece by piece. Yet among all this change, one question grew louder. Who were these humans, and why did they care? Oral walked the broken halls of his flagship, his steps heavy with thought. He had touched the hand of Captain Reyes. He had chosen trust, but trust was fragile, and his people whispered still. Some believed the humans were true allies. Others feared they were only preparing a new chain to lead them from one prison into another. That evening, Oral was invited aboard the human flagship. The ship was a vast fortress of steel, its walls humming with the power of engines stronger than anything the refugees had ever seen. Human soldiers walked the corridors, armored and armed, yet they nodded respectfully as Oral passed. It felt strange to be treated not as a burden, not as a weakling, but as a guest. Inside the command deck, Captain Reyes waited, his expression calm but his eyes sharp. He gestured to a wide projection, a map of the stars filled with roots and red marks. "These are your enemies," Reyes said, his voice steady, "and they are our enemies too." Oral studied the glowing map, his chest tightening. The red marks spread across system after system, a shadow of conquest and fire. These destroyers, they will return, Orel whispered. Reyes nodded slowly. They always return. Predators never stop unless they are made to stop. But we do not run. We never run. The words struck Orel with a force he could not explain. He remembered how the council had turned away, how they had told his people to surrender, to accept their fate. But here stood a man who spoke not of surrender, but of defiance, a man who looked at giants and did not flinch. One of the human officers stepped forward, a woman with sharp eyes and scars across her face. She tapped the map and said, "When they burned your world, the council said nothing. When they enslaved other races, the council stayed silent. But humanity remembers. We will not allow it to continue." Her voice was filled with fire, and Orel saw that it was not only Reyes, it was all of them. These humans carried something inside them, something the galaxy had lost. They carried resolve. Back on the refugee ships, Saren continued to listen to the human voices across the comms. He heard their laughter as they shared stories. He heard their discipline as they trained. They spoke of battles they had fought alone, of losses that had scarred them, and through it all they spoke with pride. "Humanity does not kneel," one voice said. Another answered, "If the stars try to break us, we break them instead." Saren could not help but whisper to himself, "They are different. They are not afraid to stand." Orel spent hours speaking with Reyes, learning about humanity. He learned that the humans had once been ignored by the council too. When an old enemy came to destroy them, no one came to help. Humanity had been left to fight alone, and they had survived not by luck but by sheer will. They had built ships of steel, weapons of thunder, and hearts that refused to surrender. They had carved their place in the galaxy not with permission, but with defiance. That night, as the refugee leaders gathered again, Orel spoke with a voice stronger than before. "I have seen the humans. I have walked their halls. They know our pain because they have lived it. They are not saviors. They are not gods. They are fighters, and they are offering us the chance to fight too." The leaders whispered, uncertain. One asked, "Fight with what? Our ships are broken. Our people are weak." Orel's eyes blazed as he answered, "Then we fight with spirit, with courage, with anything left in us, because the humans will not abandon us, and we must not abandon ourselves." Saren's message to the fleet was simple. They stood when no one else did. Now we must stand too. The words spread like a flame through the refugee ships. For the first time since their world burned, the people began to believe in something beyond survival. They began to believe in standing again. On the human flagship, Reyes watched the stars in silence. His officers asked him why he had chosen to help the refugees when the galaxy ignored them. Reyes answered with a low voice, "Because one day it could be us again, left to die, and I will not allow it, not to us, not to anyone. Humanity remembers, humanity fights." The crew nodded, their faces hard but their eyes fierce. It was not strategy, it was not politics, it was resolve. A resolve that burned brighter than any star. The refugees did not yet know what battles awaited them. They did not yet know how much blood and fire still lay ahead. But they knew this. They were not alone anymore. And with humanity's resolve, beside them, the abandoned began to feel strong again. Not because the galaxy cared, but because humanity had chosen to care. When the galaxy turned away, humanity had stood tall. And now humanity was teaching them how to stand again. The stars trembled with silence, but silence never lasted long. The refugee fleet floated near the human warships, their hulls patched, with supplies, their hearts steadier than before. For days there had been peace, a fragile peace filled with food, medicine, and hope. But peace was always an illusion when predators hunted the galaxy. It began with a faint signal, a ripple across the scanners. At first, Saren thought it was static, just another false alarm, but the readings grew clearer, stronger, darker. He stared at the screen, his mouth dry. Symbols appeared that every refugee knew too well. The enemy had returned. Orel rushed to the control deck, his face pale. "What is it?" he demanded. Though in his heart he already knew, Saren whispered. "They're warships. More than before, they are coming straight for us." The deck filled with silence, broken only by the sound of warning sirens. Voices trembled, children cried. Warriors clenched their fists in despair. The nightmare had come back. The destroyers who had burned their world were here again. On the human flagship, alarms blared as the enemy ships appeared on the projection. Dozens of massive vessels, dark and cruel, shaped like blades cutting through the void. Their engines glowed with fire, their weapons ready. Captain Reyes stood tall on the command deck, his jaw set, his eyes sharp. He turned to his officers and said in a steady voice, "Signal the refugee fleet. Tell them this. If the enemy wants them, they will have to go through us first." The words carried like thunder through the comms. The refugees gasped, some in disbelief, some in awe. No one had ever stood for them like this. No one had ever said those words. Oral closed his eyes for a moment, his chest heavy with both fear and gratitude. Then he whispered, "They are not like the Council, they do not run." The enemy ships drew closer, their weapons powering. The void filled with red warnings, flashing like the heartbeat of doom. The refugees panicked, some screaming, some begging to flee. But the humans did not waver. Their warships shifted into formation, steel walls standing between the refugees and death. Railguns hummed, missile bays opened, shields flared with energy. Every human soldier moved with purpose, their faces hard but their voices calm. They were preparing not for survival but for battle. Saren clutched the communicator in his trembling hands. He whispered into it, not even sure if anyone could hear. "Why? Why do you fight for us?" A voice answered from the human deck. Strong and fierce. Because no one else will and because it is the right thing to do. The first enemy strike came without warning. Beams of fire cut across the void, crashing against human shields. The decks shook, alarms roared. But the human warships held firm. Reyes raised his hand and gave the order. "Return fire." In an instant, the blackness of space became a storm. Missiles streaked like falling stars. Railguns thundered like distant drums. Explosions lit the void, tearing through the darkness. Human ships moved with precision, striking back with brutal force. The refugees watched in awe, their screens filled with fire and steel. They had seen battles before, but never like this. Never with someone standing between them and death. Oral gripped the railing of his command deck, his voice trembling. "They fight for us. They bleed. For us strangers who owe us nothing." One elder whispered back. Then maybe they are not strangers anymore. The battle raged on, the enemy pressing harder. For every human strike, another enemy ship advanced. The numbers were against them, the firepower overwhelming. The refugee fleet trembled, powerless. To help, fear clawed at their hearts. But in that fear, something else began to grow. A spark of courage on the refugee ships, warriors began to rise. Some rushed to repair old weapons. Some volunteered to man failing stations. Their ships were broken, their guns weak, but they refused to sit in silence any longer. Saren whispered, "If they fight for us, then we must fight too, even if we fall." Back on the human flagship, Reyes saw the enemy's endless wave. He knew the battle would not be easy. He knew blood would be spilled. But he also knew this truth. Humanity did not abandon. Humanity did not kneel. His voice echoed across the fleet. "Hold the line. Make them pay for every step." The void shook with war. The fire of cannons, the scream of engines, the thunder of resolve. The enemy came to finish the refugees. But they had found something new. They had found humanity, and humanity had drawn a line in the stars, a line that said, "You shall go no further." The void exploded into fire. The first clash shook the stars themselves. Human railguns thundered, missiles streaked across the black, and plasma beams burned bright as suns. The enemy warships answered with their own storm, unleashing fire that turned the darkness into a battlefield of light. The human flagship shook as a blast slammed against its shields. Metal groaned, alarms wailed, sparks burst across the command deck. Still, Captain Reyes stood firm, his eyes locked on the display. "Target their lead cruiser," he ordered, his voice unshaken. Cannons roared, and a massive enemy ship shuddered as steel and flame tore into its hull. It spun, broken, before vanishing into silence. The refugees watched from their crippled ships, their screens flashing with chaos. Every explosion painted their faces with firelight. Children clung to their mothers. Warriors clenched their fists. Elders whispered prayers. For the first time since their world burned, they saw hope, not in escape, but in defiance. The humans were fighting not for themselves, but for them. And the sight filled their hearts with awe, yet the enemy was endless. For every ship destroyed, another pushed forward. Their fleet was a storm of blades and fire. They struck with cruel precision, cutting into human lines, forcing the steel ships back step by step. The refugee fleet trembled, powerless. Oral's heart pounded as he watched, torn between gratitude and dread. "They cannot hold forever," he whispered, his voice breaking. On the human flagship, Reyes gripped the railing. His crew fought with steel nerves, their hands racing over controls, their voices shouting orders. The deck shook with every strike, but their eyes never wavered. "Brace the port side." One shouted. "Counterfire on Vector 3, another yelled. Their unity was a weapon as sharp as any blade. They fought not as machines, but as one living force. A sudden blast tore through a smaller human frigate. The ship split apart, fire pouring from its broken hull. Voices screamed across the comms, then faded into silence. The refugees gasped, horror cutting through their brief hope, but Reyes's voice thundered across the fleet. "They died holding the line. Honor them by standing firm." And the humans roared back as one. "Yes, Captain." Saren sat by his communicator, his hands trembling as he listened. The sounds of battle poured through. Explosions, shouts, the steady commands of human officers, he whispered to himself. "They are bleeding for us and we are just watching." His chest ached with guilt, his heart burned with shame. On the refugee decks, others felt the same. Warriors who had once fought now stood idle, their ships broken, their weapons weak. But their pride began to stir. One warrior slammed his fist against the console and shouted, "No more hiding. If they fight for us, we fight with them." Others rose, voices joining in. "Our ships may be broken, but our spirits are not." Meanwhile, the battle grew fiercer. Human destroyers weaved between enemy cruisers, trading fire in deadly dances. Every blast shook their hulls, every hit scarred their armor. But they pressed forward, refusing to yield. Enemy fighters swarmed like locusts, hammering human shields. Yet even in the chaos, the humans struck back with precision, turning death into resistance, turning despair into fire. Oral stood before his people, his voice fierce for the first time in weeks. "Prepare what weapons remain. Repair what engines still work. We will not let them fight alone." The refugees stared at him, shocked. "Our ships are falling apart," one elder said. Orel's eyes burned. "Then let them fall apart in battle, not in silence." On the human flagship, Reyes heard the faint signal of refugee ships powering weapons. At first he frowned, thinking it was desperation. But when he saw them moving forward, even in their broken state, his eyes softened. "They choose to stand," he whispered. He turned to his crew and shouted, "Protect them. Fight with them. Today they rise again." The battle roared louder. Refugee ships, weak and scarred, fired alongside human warships. Their weapons were small, their shields thin, but their courage was vast. Together they pushed back, striking the enemy with fire. And defiance. For the first time, the destroyers faltered. The refugees were no longer prey, they were warriors reborn. Saren's hands shook as he fired the old cannons of his ship. The recoil nearly tore the system apart. But the shot struck an enemy fighter and sent it spinning into flames. He laughed, tears streaming down his face. "For our world, for those we lost," he cried. Around him, others joined, their voices rising across the comms. They no longer sounded like a dying people. They sounded like a people alive again. The enemy, shocked by the sudden resistance, tightened their lines. Their ships unleashed another wave of destruction. But humanity and the refugees held together, steel and spirit bound by one truth: they would not surrender. They would not kneel. The void burned with war, with fire and courage, with death and defiance, and, though the battle was far from over, a truth had already been written in the stars. The abandoned were no longer alone. Humanity had chosen to fight, and the refugees had chosen to rise. Together they stood against the storm, and for the first time the enemy knew fear. The battle raged like a storm without end. Flames lit the dark void as ships burned and shattered. The humans fought with unyielding strength, their steel ships pushing back again and again, but the enemy was endless. Waves of warships pouring in, cutting through the stars like blades. Captain Reyes stood tall on the human flagship, his voice steady even as the deck shook. "Hold formation," he commanded, his eyes never leaving the projection. Around him officers shouted, sparks rained from broken panels. The air smelled of smoke and fire. Every strike against the hull made the ship groan, yet still they stood. The refugees watched with wide eyes, their own ships trembling under stray fire. They had joined the fight, their weapons firing weak shots, their engines screaming to hold together. But compared to the humans, their power was a whisper. Still, a whisper was louder than silence, and it gave them pride. A massive explosion lit the void as a human destroyer was torn apart. The shockwave rippled across the battlefield, shattering the hearts of those who saw it. On the refugee ships, children screamed, elders covered their faces, warriors gritted their teeth. "They are falling," one whispered, his voice filled with dread. Reyes clenched his fists, his jaw tight. The enemy pressed harder, surrounding the humans, hammering their shields, tearing at their armor. The fleet was outnumbered, outgunned. Every loss was felt like a knife in the soul. Still Reyes roared across the comms, "Do not yield, we fight until the last breath." But inside, he knew the truth. Humanity was strong, but even strength had limits. Their ships were breaking, their ammunition running low. If the tide did not change soon, they would be swept away on the refugee flagship. Orel stood before his council. He saw fear in their eyes, the same fear that had lived in them since their world was destroyed. One elder spoke, his voice trembling. "If the humans fall, we fall too. Maybe we should retreat. Maybe we should scatter and hope some survive." The words cut like poison. Orel slammed his hand against the console, his voice fierce. "No, we have run before and we lost everything. If we run again, we lose our honor. If they fight for us, we fight with them until the end." The council fell silent, stunned by the fire in his tone. Never before had Orel spoken with such strength. He turned to his crew and shouted, "Prepare all ships, even the broken ones. Power every weapon, every engine. We join the line." His voice echoed across the fleet, and for the first time the refugees answered not with silence but with courage. One by one, refugee ships pushed forward, their hulls cracked, their shields weak, but their engines burned bright. They formed a wall beside the humans. Standing shoulder to shoulder in the stars, Saren's ship shook violently as he forced the old cannons to fire. Bolts of energy streaked out, striking enemy fighters. He laughed, even as tears filled his eyes. "We are not prey anymore. We are warriors." The humans saw the refugee ships move into the line. Some officers gasped in disbelief, others smiled with pride. On the flagship, Reyes's eyes softened for a moment. "They chose to fight," he whispered. Then louder he roared, "Together we push them back." The battlefield changed. The humans no longer stood alone. Every refugee shot, no matter how small, joined the storm. Every broken ship that refused to fall became a symbol. The enemy, so sure of victory, faltered as resistance grew stronger. The line that had been bending began to hold. Still, the cost was high. Another human frigate exploded. Another refugee ship was split in half. The cries of the dying echoed across the comms. But now those cries were not of despair. They were of defiance. "We stand," voices shouted. "For our world," others answered. "For each other." The humans roared back. In the chaos, Orel himself took the helm of his flagship. He had never been a warrior, but in that moment, he became one. He led the charge beside Reyes, his ship firing every weapon it had left. Saren's voice came through the comms, young but strong. "We will not run. Not again. Oral smiled through the fire. No, not again, he whispered. The turning point came when the enemy flagship moved forward, a monstrous vessel, larger than anything in the battle, its weapons glowing with deadly light. It fired, and the human flagship shook, its shields shattering, its hull cracking. For a moment, it seemed all was lost. But before the enemy could fire again, refugee ships swarmed like hornets. They rammed, they fired, they sacrificed themselves. Broken ships struck the giant like knives of defiance. And for the first time, the enemy flagship staggered. Reyes saw the opening. His voice thundered, "All ships concentrate fire, bring it down." The void lit up with missiles, cannons, and beams. The enemy flagship shuddered, its armor cracking, its engines failing. Finally, with a roar that echoed across the stars, it exploded in a storm of fire. The battlefield went silent for a heartbeat. Then the enemy began to pull back, retreating into the void. They had come to finish the refugees, but instead, they had been stopped by humanity, and by those they had abandoned. The refugees cheered through tears, their voices raw. The humans shouted in triumph, their pride unshaken. And in the middle of the fire and smoke, Oral whispered, "This was the turning point. We are no longer abandoned. We stand together." The battlefield was quiet at last. The stars that had burned with fire now flickered with the wreckage of broken ships. Debris drifted slowly, glowing faintly as it cooled. The enemy had retreated into the shadows, leaving only silence behind on the human flagship. The deck was filled with smoke and sparks. Soldiers limped to their stations. Medics rushed to the wounded, the air thick with the smell of burnt metal. Captain Reyes stood tall in the center, his armor cracked, his face streaked with blood and ash, yet his eyes were alive with fire, not of anger but of victory. He looked at the display, at the scattered human ships, many broken, some gone forever. He looked at the refugee vessels, scarred and battered, yet still standing. And he whispered, almost to himself, "They fought. They truly fought." Across the comms came voices of triumph. Refugees who had once whispered in despair now shouted with pride. "We stood with them," one cried. "We did not run," another cheered. For the first time since their world was destroyed, their voices carried not sorrow, but strength. Oral stood on the bridge of his flagship, his body trembling, his eyes wet. He had led his people through fear and silence, and now he had led them into battle. The cost had been high, ships lost, lives gone. But his people had found something greater. They had found their courage again. He turned to his crew and said, his voice steady, "Remember this day, remember that we are not ghosts, we are not forgotten, we stand." Saren sat at the broken console of his ship, his hands burned, his eyes heavy. But he smiled through the pain. He had fired until his cannons melted. He had fought until his voice gave out. Now, looking at the human fleet holding beside them, he whispered, "They did not abandon us, and we did not abandon ourselves." On the human flagship, Reyes opened a channel to the entire fleet. His voice echoed through the ships, strong and clear. Today the enemy came to end a people, but they failed. They failed because humanity does not walk away. And because you, the abandoned, chose to rise. You are no longer refugees, you are warriors. The refugees listened, their hearts pounding. No one had ever spoken to them like this. No one had ever lifted them instead of pushing them down. In that moment, they felt a bond stronger than treaties, stronger than politics, a bond written in blood, sacrifice, and defiance. The survivors of both fleets began to work side by side. Humans guided refugees in repairing their ships. Refugees offered knowledge of systems unknown to humans. Together, they built, together they healed. What the galaxy had broken, they began to rebuild as one. But the scars of battle remained. Every survivor knew the enemy was not gone forever. They would return, stronger, hungrier, crueler. The galaxy would still turn away, still hide behind silence. But now, when the enemy came again, the refugees would not face them alone. They would face them with humanity. Late that cycle, Aurel and Reyes met again on the command deck. The stars stretched endlessly before them, quiet now, but heavy with promise. Oral bowed his head, his voice low. My people owe you everything, but I fear we cannot repay such a debt. Reyes shook, his head firmly. There is no debt. This is not charity. This is what it means to stand together. Oral lifted his eyes, and for the first time in many years he smiled. You are not like the council. You are not like the others. You see us not as weak, but as equals. Reyes's gaze hardened, his voice sharp but proud. The galaxy abandoned you, but humanity never will. We will stand with you always. The words echoed across the comms, carried through every ship. Refugees and humans alike repeated them, their voices uniting in one chorus. We stand together. The stars themselves seemed to tremble with the sound. It was not the end of the war, it was only the beginning. But beginnings mattered, and this one was forged in fire. The enemy would remember this day, the day the abandoned refused to die, the day humanity stood beside them and changed the story. As the fleets moved forward into the unknown, scarred but unbroken, the message remained clear. They were no longer prey, no longer forgotten. They were allies, they were warriors, they were survivors. And though the galaxy had turned away, one truth now burned brighter than any star. When the darkness came, when the enemy roared, humanity had spoken, and their words would never be forgotten. We are with you,